The air inside Danesfield House carries a strange and discordant sweetness. It is May of 1942. The heavy, perfumed scent of mauve wisteria drifts through the open windows, clashing with the sharp, acidic tang of photographic fixative and the stale haze of cigarettes. Inside a wood-paneled room that once served as a Victorian nursery, Constance Babington Smith leans into the rubber eyepieces of her stereoscope. Her world has narrowed to a few square inches of grainy black and white film. The physical toll of the interpretation stare is a dull, rhythmic throb behind her eyes. It is a pressure born from hours of forcing two flat images to fuse into a single, three-dimensional landscape. Beneath her lens lies Peenemünde, a remote spit of land on the Baltic coast that looks at first glance like a desolate holiday camp. Then she stops. Her breath hitches in the quiet room, audible over the distant, rhythmic clatter of a telex machine. There, resting on a concrete slab near the water's edge, is a tiny, cruciform shape. It is no larger than a sharpened pencil tip. It does not move. There is no fire, no roar of engines, and no scream of sirens. There is only the clinical, scratching sound of a pen as Constance circles the object in ink. In this hushed moment of academic deduction, she is looking at the first tangible evidence of the V-1 flying bomb. This is a weapon Hitler intends to use to turn London into a funeral pyre. For now, she is the only person in the world who knows it exists. But to understand this moment of scientific clarity, we must look back to the beginning of the nightmare. 3 years earlier, in the autumn of 1939, the Royal Air Force was a blind giant. Britain was stumbling into the greatest conflict in human history, with its eyes shut. The prevailing doctrine of the time was a death sentence for the men in the cockpits. Commanders sent slow, unarmored bombers at low altitudes to squint at enemy positions through handheld cameras. The results were catastrophic. Pilots flew into walls of flak at 200 miles per hour. They returned, if they returned at all, with blurred and useless snapshots of treetops and smoke. In the first 4 months of the war, 89 sorties were launched. Nearly 20 aircraft were swatted from the sky. 44 missions produced absolutely zero intelligence. The military bureaucracy was rigid and arrogant. They treated reconnaissance with the disdain of an old-fashioned cavalry officer forced to look at a map. Into this suffocating environment of dread stepped Sidney Cotton. He was a quintessential difficult genius with a jaunty cap and a total contempt for red tape. Cotton did not care for salutes or kit inspections. He cared about the physics of the stratosphere. He took the legendary Spitfire and performed a radical surgery on its frame. He stripped away the guns, the armor plating, and the radio sets. He removed anything that added weight. He painted the bellies of the planes a specific, haunting shade of camo tint blue. This made them vanish against the deep azure of the high heavens. By the winter of 1939, Cotton was pushing these modified machines into the dark, freezing silence of 30,000 feet. Inside the cockpit, the temperature plunged to 40 degrees below zero. The pilot's breath froze into jagged crystals on his oxygen mask. His fingers went numb despite layers of silk and wool. The adrenaline of the flight was tempered by a terrifying detachment caused by the thin, recycled air. A single malfunction in the oxygen line meant delirium and a fatal dive within 60 seconds. Yet, while the pilot shivered in an unheated metal shell, the cameras remained warm. Cotton had rigged a system of heated air ducts to prevent the high-altitude cold from cracking the glass plates or freezing the shutter mechanisms. He was a ghost in the machine. He flew joyrides over the Rhine with unsuspecting German officers. He secretly captured the jagged teeth of the Siegfried Line while his passengers chatted about the weather. This was the rebirth of a discipline that had been forged in the mud of 1916. Decades earlier, Sergeant Major Victor Lors had stood in a sodden trench in France. He stared at an aerial plate until he realized that the earth possessed a memory. He saw that the subtle crushed grass where a battery had moved could be read like a ledger. He realized that the faint discoloration of soil over a buried cable revealed a hidden truth. It was a science of shadows and disturbances. By 1918, the military was processing 10 million photographs a year. They treated the battlefield like a fossil bed to be picked apart with tweezers, but the interwar years had seen this expertise wither. The specialists were sent back to their universities. The dark rooms were dismantled. The Royal Air Force reverted to the gentlemanly, primitive era of biplanes and revolvers. It took the defiance of outsiders like Cotton and the quiet, obsessive labor of women like Constance Babington Smith to prove a vital point. The war would not be won by those who could fight the hardest, but by those who could see what lay on the other side of the hill. By the spring of 1941, the era of the gallant amateur was dying. It was smothered by the sheer, crushing scale of a global war. If Sydney Cotton provided the Allied effort with its eyes, the transition to Danesfield House represented the birth of its brain. This was a sprawling, mock Tudor mansion overlooking the Thames at Medmenham. It was no longer a flying club of jaunty caps and private planes. It was the institutionalization of genius. Within these walls, the madmen of Ham were forging a university of war. The curriculum was written in shadows, wakes, and the subtle crushing of grass. The atmosphere inside Medmenham was a surreal collision of a Cambridge common room and a high-stakes industrial factory. In the wood-panelled library, archaeologists like Glyn Daniel worked alongside geologists, botanists, and even ballet designers. They were recruited for their unique ability to look at a landscape and see a narrative of human activity. To a paleobotanist, a slight change in the hue of a field was the telltale sign of a buried fuel dump leaching chemicals into the soil. To an archaeologist, a series of indentations in the dirt was the ghost of a mobile radar unit that moved under the cover of night. This academic rigor was codified into the three-phase system. Phase 1 was the frantic, adrenaline-fueled sprint. As soon as a Spitfire's wheels touched the tarmac, the film was rushed to the lab. Within 3 hours, interpreters were squinting at wet negatives to spot immediate threats like ships leaving harbor. Phase 2 was the 12-hour grind, a detailed accounting of every aircraft and barge within a sector. But Phase 3 was where the war was truly won. This was the deep tissue massage of intelligence. Specialists spent weeks or months tracking the industrial output of a single German factory. They watched the agonizingly slow construction of a secret weapon site. They were the truth-tellers in a world of propaganda and smoke. Into this splendid and inspired madhouse of eccentric professors and frantic young women steps Douglas Kendall. If the unit is a chaotic orchestra of genius, Kendall is the man who seizes the baton. He realizes that the mountainous, ever-growing piles of millions of photographic prints will bury them if they do not find a way to navigate the data. Imagine a Tuesday afternoon in the heart of the house. Kendall stands before a massive, multi-ton Swiss-made stereo plotter. It is a beast of brass and glass that looks more like a clockmaker's fever dream than a weapon of war. The room is quiet, save for the low hum of the cooling fans and the scratching of pens on tracing paper. Kendall watches as an interpreter peers through the optics. There is a sharp, audible click as the two separate aerial images suddenly fuse in the interpreter's mind. This is the pop. It is the moment of stereoscopic fusion, where a flat grey smudge on a piece of paper suddenly erupts into a three-dimensional world. A chimney stack doesn't just appear, it towers. A trench doesn't just show as a line, it becomes a jagged wound in the earth that can be measured to the inch. Kendall begins to organize this chaotic genius into specialized sections, turning the mansion into a jigsaw center. He demands a new kind of precision, utilizing a strange wooden spherical device created by Claude W. Wavell to calculate the height of a ship's mast, simply by measuring the length of its shadow on the water. Under Kendall's hand, the work becomes cold and devastatingly effective. They aren't just looking at pictures, they are performing a post-mortem on the German war machine while it is still alive. Whether it is Sarah Churchill asking for 2 of her father's petrol coupons for a colleague, or the quiet intensity of the interpretation stare that leaves analysts with a throbbing pressure behind their temples, Medmenham has become the essential keystone. The mavericks have been replaced by the scientists. The madmen are now the only ones who can see the true shape of the monster they are fighting. But in the summer of 1941, a jagged and uncomfortable fissure opens between the heroism of the cockpit and the cold, unyielding reality of the darkroom. For 2 years, the public has been fed a diet of the bomber myth. These are tales of gallant crews raining fire upon the heart of the Reich, obliterating factories and shattering German morale. But inside the interpretation section at Danesfield House, the air is thick with a different kind of tension. In a cramped converted bathroom, where the smell of damp porcelain mixes with the acidic tang of chemicals, a civil servant named David Ben-Susam Butt is performing a strategic autopsy. He is surrounded by 600 photographs, each one a silent witness to a night raid. As he leans over the prints, the mythology of the gallant Air Force begins to dissolve. The photographs don't show burning refineries or collapsed bridges. They show empty fields, silent forests, and the unruffled surfaces of rivers miles away from their targets. The data is a gut punch, On moonless nights, only 1 in 15 bombers manages to drop its payload within 5 miles of the objective. In the industrial heart of Germany, the success rate is even grimmer. The truth-tellers have realized that for all the thunder of the engines and the bravery of the boys in the sky, the British are effectively bombing the German countryside. This revelation triggers a silent war within the war. Air Marshal Harris and the High Command initially treat these findings with a mixture of disbelief and institutional fury. They prefer the subjective reports of pilots who, blinded by searchlights and deafened by flak, genuinely believe their bombs have found the mark. But the camera does not suffer from adrenaline or fear. It is a clinical observer. This friction forces a brutal evolution. The Air Force must stop being a blunt instrument of area bombing and become a precision machine guided by the men with magnifying glasses. While the analysts in England grapple with the statistics of failure, a different kind of drama is playing out in the scorched, dust-blown skies over Malta. Adrian Warburton is the antithesis of the disciplined military officer. He has a profile like a Greek god, flowing blonde hair and a cigarette perpetually glued to his lip. He lives in a state of dynamic individualism. His aircraft is stripped of its guns, leaving him defenseless in a sky swarming with Italian and German fighters. In the heat of the Mediterranean, the psychological profile of the reconnaissance pilot reaches its breaking point. Warburton operates in a world of absolute isolation. He cannot fight back. His only weapon is his speed and his shutter. Imagine a shimmering afternoon over Taranto harbor. The vibration of the twin engines thrums through Warburton's boots as he pushes the aircraft into a dicing run. This is a low-level, high-speed dash at mast height. The smell of high-octane fuel and sweat fills the cockpit. Below him, the Italian fleet sits like toy boats in a bathtub. The flak begins to bloom in the air around him. These are black smudges of cordite and jagged shards of steel, but Warburton doesn't bank away. He steers with one hand, his cap balanced precariously on his head, waiting for the precise second to trigger the cameras. He is a lone wolf, enduring a sensory nightmare of roaring wind and the violent judder of the airframe. He knows that a single mechanical hiccup means a watery grave. When he returns to the dry, rocky tarmac of Malta, his aircraft is often shredded. Sometimes a ship's aerial is found snagged on his tailwheel. This is visceral, metal and canvas proof of his proximity to death. He represents the reconnaissance pilot in his purest form. He is a man who has seen too much from too close. Yet he must remain a detached observer of the destruction he facilitates. But the ultimate test of this secret science arrives on May 21, 1941, in the deep, shadow-drenched fjords of Norway. The British Admiralty is paralyzed by a ghost. The Bismarck, this massive battleship, is a 50,000-ton leviathan capable of severing the Atlantic lifelines, and it has vanished into the North Sea mists. The hunt is no longer a matter of tactical curiosity. It is a struggle for national survival. Enter Michael Babe Suckling. He is a young pilot, barely into his 20s, sitting in the cramped, unheated cockpit of a modified Spitfire. At 30,000 feet, the world is a silent, dark azure. The temperature is 40 degrees below zero. The only sound is the rhythmic, mechanical rasp of his oxygen regulator. Suckling is flying on dead reckoning, his eyes scanning the endless, jagged grey of the Norwegian coastline. His fuel gauge is a constant, ticking anxiety. It is a relentless countdown against the vastness of the sea. Suddenly, he sees it. Deep within the fjord, tucked against the wooded slopes like a sleeping predator, is a shape that doesn't belong to nature. Suckling banks the Spitfire, the force of the turn pressing him into his seat as he aligns the nose. He doesn't just see a ship, he sees a strategic crisis. Through the 36-inch lens of the camera, the Bismarck and its escort are captured in a series of sharp, overlapping frames. The three-dimensional pop of the image will occur later, in a darkroom. But in this moment, Suckling feels the adrenaline spike of the garden thief. He has plucked the secret from the enemy's pocket. The return flight is a grueling test of nerves. The North Sea is a slate-grey void, and the Spitfire's engine coughs as the fuel tanks run dry. Suckling touches down in the blackout at St. Eval, his legs shaking so violently from the cold and the tension that he can barely climb out of the cockpit. He is still in his oily flying suit, his face marked by the red indentations of the oxygen mask. When he is denied entry to the officer's mess, he does not care. The film is already in the hands of the couriers, rushing toward Medmenham in a blue Humber Snipe. Hours later, David Linton and Eve Holliday lean over the stereo plotter at Danesfield House. As the images fuse, The Bismarck leaps into 3 dimensions. They can see the sailors on the deck and measure the mast heights to within a single foot. This is no longer just a photograph, it is a target. Within minutes, the intelligence is flashed to the Admiralty. The madmen of Ham have provided the eyes for the fleet, transforming a static intelligence exercise into a lethal, high-stakes pursuit across the Atlantic. The hunt for the Bismarck has begun, and it was won not by a broadside of naval guns, but by a single, unarmed boy in a blue plane and the quiet, obsessive scholars who knew how to read the shadows he brought home. But to understand the true weight of this visual mastery, we must look to the summer of 1942, when the War of Shadows reached a brutal impasse. The Allied commanders were no longer content with merely surviving the German onslaught. They were beginning to dream of the return to the continent. But the Great Crusade was nearly strangled in its cradle on a jagged, blood-soaked stretch of coastline called Dieppe. Stop the clock on the morning of August 19, 1942. The air over the French port is a toxic soup of cordite, burning oil, and the screams of men trapped in a killing jar. On the beach, the Canadian infantry is learning a lesson written in lead. The sensory reality is a nightmare of mechanical failure, as the heavy tanks, designed to be the iron fist of the invasion, churn helplessly. Their tracks slip and grind against the shingle, those large, smooth pebbles that make up the beach. To the planners in London, the aerial photos had shown a beach. To the men on the ground, those pebbles are ball bearings that turn a 40-ton tank into a stationary target. The infantry, pinned against a seawall they did not know was so high, are being methodically dismantled by German gunners who have a perfect, unobstructed view from the cliffs above. Of the 6,000 men who hit the shore, nearly 4,000 are killed, wounded, or captured in a matter of hours. This slaughter acts as a cold, clarifying catalyst back at Medmenham. The disaster at Dieppe exposes a fatal, systemic rot. The Allies are still looking at the world in 2 dimensions. They have been hunting for things, guns, ships, and planes, but they have ignored the where. They realized with a sickening clarity that they did not just need to see the enemy, they needed to understand the very skin of the earth. The failure at Dieppe transforms aerial reconnaissance from a tactical scouting tool into a massive, multidisciplinary engineering project. It is no longer enough to circle a battery on a map. The experts now need to calculate the height of a seawall from a shadow, the depth of a tide from the color of the water, and the load-bearing capacity of a beach by the size of its pebbles. As the mission expands, the gentlemanly academic atmosphere of Danesfield House is flooded by a new brash energy. The war is moving from a British struggle for survival to an Allied industrial crusade, and by early 1944, Medmenham has evolved into the Allied Central Interpretation Unit. The mecca of photo interpretation is now a multinational hive where hundreds of Americans labor alongside their British counterparts. But this unification is not a seamless marriage. It is a shotgun wedding held together by high-stakes diplomacy and the looming shadow of D-Day. The tension reaches a peak in February 1944, inside the plush, smoke-filled sanctuary of Claridge's Hotel in London. The air is thick with the scent of expensive brandy and the heavy aromatic fog of Cuban cigars. Douglas Kendall, the man who had organized the chaotic genius of Medmenham, sits across from Ambassador John Winant and Elliott Roosevelt. The Americans, backed by the staggering scale of the arsenal of democracy, want their own independent intelligence infrastructure. They want to break the units apart and decentralize the eyes of the army. Kendall knows this would be a death sentence for the invasion. He knows that the truth of the photograph relies on the centralized, cross-referenced expertise of the archaeologists and geologists who have spent years learning the grammar of the French landscape. In a moment of brilliance, Kendall and Winant orchestrate a quiet power play. They argue that the complexity of the coming invasion, the sheer volume of data required to map every square inch of Normandy, cannot survive the fragmentation of the unit. They win. The unit remains a unified brain, ensuring that when a pilot snaps a picture of a German radar mast, it is processed by the same expert who identified the V-weapons at Peenemünde. With the bureaucracy secured, the work at Medmenham turns obsessive. The going maps become the obsession of the specialized sections. Inside the mansion's workshop, the smell of damp clay and fresh ink replaces the scent of wisteria. Interpreters are no longer just looking at photos. They are building a miniature world. Using saws, hammers, and layers of board, they construct massive-scale models of the Normandy coast. These are tactile, 3-dimensional landscapes so detailed they include the specific height of the hedgerows and the exact curvature of the steel obstacles impaling gliders. Stop the clock on a quiet midnight in May 1944. An interpreter leans over a scale model of a drop zone near Sainte-Mère-Église. His eyes are red-rimmed and his fingers are stained with the clay he has been molding to match the latest reconnaissance flight. He is not looking for a tank, he is counting pebbles. He is measuring the distance between the jagged steel obstacles the Germans have planted in the surf and calculating the exact second the tide will expose them. This is the invisible invasion. Before a single boot touches the sand, the soldiers have already flown through this landscape in the quiet halls of Medmenham. They have memorized the grain of the wood on the pillbox doors and the specific shadows of the church steeples. The Allies have replaced the blind gamble of Dieppe with a managed engineering project of staggering precision. They have turned the unblinking eye of the camera into the primary architect of the liberation of Europe. Now we return to that hushed room and the desk of Constance Babington Smith. The air in the Victorian nursery at Danesfield House remains frozen in that singular moment of academic deduction, but the clock has finally begun to tick again. Her pen completes the circle around that tiny cruciform shape at Peenemünde. That mark effectively signs the death warrant for the German rocket program. The pop of stereoscopic fusion has moved from a mere optical thrill to a strategic earthquake. It is June 1943, and the secret is out. The V-1 flying bomb, Hitler's vengeance weapon, has been stripped of its invisibility. The identification of this threat leads directly to the massive bombing raid of August 17, 1943. The German rocket program is delayed by months, potentially saving the entire D-Day assembly from annihilation before it ever leaves the English ports. But even with this godlike perspective, the camera has its limits. History is not just what we see, but what we choose to look at. This brings us to a somber exploration of a failure of institutional intent. During these same years, interpreters captured the stark reality of the Holocaust on film. The imagery of Auschwitz was recorded with clinical clarity, yet the significance of the camps was missed because of a narrow, military-centric focus. The tragedy was not that the camps were hidden, but that they were seen and not read. The experts were looking for factories and fuel depots, blinded by the requirements of the Industrial War. This remains the haunting legacy of the unblinking eye, as we transition from the era of film ejection capsules to the modern digital battlefield. The power of the image has only grown. The satellite revolution and the rise of electro-optical scanners have created a world of constant surveillance. Commanders now manage targets from thousands of miles away in a digital landscape. Warfare has shifted from intuition to a data-driven reality. Yet the camera remains the final arbiter of history. Look at the celebrated accounts of the band of brothers at Brecourt Manor. For decades, the story was told through the lens of memory and heroic memoirs, but a single aerial photo from 1944 was used to factually correct those military accounts. The frozen truth of the photograph proved exactly where the guns were placed and how the battle truly unfolded. The legacy of the spies in the sky is not just found in the targets they destroyed, it is found in the objective reality they preserved. From the grainy frames of Peenemünde to the digital feeds of today, the image remains the judge of our past and the architect of our future. The ripple effect of that small ink circle is instantaneous and violent. Within weeks, the clinical silence of the interpretation room is replaced by the thunder of 600 Lancasters and Halifaxes screaming over the Baltic coast. On the night of August 17, 1943, Operation Hydra unleashes 1,600 tons of high explosives upon the holiday camp atmosphere of Peenemünde. The sensory reality on the ground is a hellscape of searing heat and pulverized concrete. A storm of fire kills hundreds of German scientists and forces the entire rocket program into the cramped, dark limestone tunnels of the Harz Mountains. The delay is measured in months, but those months are the difference between life and death for the Allied cause. Had those rockets been ready in the spring of 1944, the massive assembly of men and steel clogging the ports of southern England for D-Day would have been a static, helpless target for a rain of fire. The madmen of Ham did not just find a weapon. They saved the invasion before a single soldier ever stepped onto a landing craft. Yet this unparalleled power to peel back the roof of the world carried with it a haunting, systemic blindness. By the summer of 1944, the Allied Central Interpretation Unit had become a machine of terrifying efficiency. The experts were capable of tracking the flow of synthetic oil and the diameter of ball bearings from 30,000 feet. But this clinical military focus created a vacuum of imagination that would lead to one of the greatest moral tragedies in human history. Stop the clock on August 23, 1944. The sun is high and bright over Nazi-occupied Poland, casting long, sharp shadows across a sprawling industrial complex known as IG Farben Monowitz. A South African pilot in a lone Mosquito triggers his cameras, his engines a distant hum in the stratosphere. The resulting film is rushed back to Medmenham and laid out on long wooden tables. The interpreters lean in, their magnifying glasses hovering over the grainy black and white mosaics. They are looking for synthetic rubber. They are looking for the vital organs of the German war machine. They see the chimneys. They see the sprawling honeycomb of barracks. They see the smoke, heavy and dark, belching from open pits and L-shaped buildings near the rail sidings of a place called Auschwitz-Birkenau. The camera, in its unblinking objective honesty, captures it all. It records the lines of tiny pixelated dots that are, in reality, thousands of human beings being marched toward their deaths. The images are so clear that the individual shadows of the guards can be discerned on the gravel. But the academic mind, trained to see the war as a series of industrial metrics, fails to read the truth. The interpreters label the crematoria as bakeries or laundries. They track the water usage of the chemical plant with obsessive detail, but they ignore the industrial process of slaughter unfolding in plain sight, just a few hundred yards away. The tragedy was not that the Holocaust was hidden. The tragedy was that it was documented in micro-detail and then filed away in a grey cabinet, because it did not fit the military paradigm of the day. The all-seeing eyes of the reconnaissance units saw the smoke of the crematoria rising into the Polish sky, but the collective brain at Medmenham was looking for rubber, and so the smoke was dismissed as a mere byproduct of industry. This is the final bitter irony of the aerial intelligence revolution. The same scientific detachment that allowed a young woman in a country house to dismantle a secret rocket program also allowed a professional bureaucracy to look directly at the face of genocide and see only a factory. As the war grinded toward its conclusion, the interpreters continued their grueling 36-hour shifts, their eyes burned from the interpretation stare, their world defined by the contrast between the adrenaline of the flight and the cold, detached reality of the print. They had mastered the art of seeing the unseen, transforming the fog of war into a clinical precision that dictated the fate of nations. But as the shadows of the Cold War began to lengthen, they were left with the weight of what they had seen and what they had failed to understand. They had proved that while the camera can never lie, the human heart remains the most difficult landscape of all to interpret. The smoke of 1945 had barely cleared from the ruins of Berlin before the all-seeing hawks of Medmenham were ushered into a new, even colder shadow. The Spitfires and the plywood Mosquitoes were mothballed and their cameras were greased and stored, but the science they birthed did not die, it simply ascended. The unblinking eye that once hunted for V-2 rockets in the Baltic now reached for the edge of the atmosphere. The spies in the sky traded the country house atmosphere of Danesfield House for the sterile, pressurized silence of the stratosphere. The Allied machine pivoted from a hot war of survival to a silent war of mutual deterrence. Stop the clock on a crisp morning in August 1960, high over the Pacific Ocean. The air is thin, a deep, dark violet that marks the boundary between the world and the void. Inside the cockpit of a specially modified C-130 Hercules, the pilot's hands are steady on the controls, but the tension is a physical weight. He is hunting a falling star. This is the Corona program, the first generation of satellite reconnaissance. It represents the ultimate evolution of the film rushing units that once operated out of Medmenham. Below the aircraft, a small gold-plated capsule has detached from a satellite and plummeted through the atmosphere. Its heat shield glows cherry red before the parachutes deploy. The pilot watches as the tiny white canopy blooms against the vast blue of the ocean. He is not just flying a plane, he is operating a mid-air trapeze. He aligns the recovery rig, a set of giant steel poles extending from the tail of the Hercules, and dives toward the descending silk. There is a violent metallic clack as the hooks snag the shroud lines. The capsule, containing miles of film that have captured the secret heart of the Soviet Union, is winched into the cargo hold. The smell of ozone and cold hydraulic fluid fills the bay. This is the satellite revolution. It is a world where the camera is no longer a guest in the enemy's sky, but a permanent celestial resident. This transition from film to digital scanners marks the birth of the Death Star paradigm. The war has moved from the muddy, chemical-scented darkrooms of the 1940s to air-conditioned operations centers thousands of miles from the front. The interpretation stare of the Second World War has evolved into kill TV. It is a detached viewing experience where commanders sit in ergonomic chairs while watching live, high-definition feeds from drones circling over a desert half a world away. The adrenaline of the Spitfire pilot has been replaced by the hum of servers and the soft click of a mouse. In this digital battlefield, the distance between the eye and the target has become absolute, yet the moral weight remains. The madmen of Ham have been replaced by algorithms and silicon, but the fundamental mission remains the same. The goal is still to find the needle in the haystack before it can be used to kill. But the true legacy of the photo-intelligence revolution is not found in the technology of destruction. It is found in the unyielding, frozen truth of the image itself. The camera remains the final arbiter of history. It is a witness that cannot be corrupted by the fog of war or the fallibility of human memory. We stop the clock one final time, decades after the guns of the Great War have fallen silent. The setting is a quiet room, far removed from the roar of radial engines and the stench of cordite. Captain Dick Winters, the legendary commander of Easy Company, sits at a simple table. He is a man whose memory of the conflict has been codified into books, television, and the collective consciousness of an entire generation. Winters is speaking about the Brecourt Manor assault on D-Day, that textbook tactical maneuver where he and a handful of paratroopers neutralized a battery of German 105mm guns. He is certain of his story because he has lived it every day for 50 years. He remembers the alignment of the trenches, the position of the guns, and the direction of the charge. It is a memory etched in the blood of his friends and the mud of Normandy. Then a researcher slides a single, grainy black and white photograph across the table toward him. It is an aerial reconnaissance plate, captured by a lone Spitfire pilot on the morning of June 6, 1944. The room goes silent. Winters leans in, a magnifying glass held in a hand that survived the jump into the dark. There is only the soft crinkle of the paper and the sharp, clinical clarity of the image. As he peers through the lens, the sudden jarring pop of recognition occurs. The photograph does not match the legend. The guns are not where he remembered them. The trenches follow a different curve of the earth than the one he has described for half a century. The hedgerows he thought provided cover are revealed to be nothing but open ground. The frozen truth of the photograph strips away the watercolor layers of human memory. Winters, the hero of the story, is visibly shaken. His brow furrows as he confronts the objective reality captured from 30,000 feet. The camera, unburdened by the terror of the jump or the scream of the shells, had seen what the human eye could not. It is a profound, humbling moment of correction. The legend remains intact, but the photograph provides the granite foundation of fact. This is the final verdict of the image. From the sticky backs of the First World War to the digital mosaics of the modern era, the evolution of aerial intelligence has been a struggle to replace the gentlemanly guesswork of the past with a cold, calculated precision. It proved that the war was won as much by those who could see as by those who could fight. The legacy of Medmenham lives on in every satellite that passes overhead and every drone that watches from the clouds. It is a permanent, unblinking eye that reminds us that while men may forget and history may be rewritten, the light reflecting off the earth at a specific moment in time is a secret that can never be truly buried. The spies in the sky have ensured that the world is no longer a place of shadows. It is now a landscape forever illuminated by the lens. If you value these historical accounts, please subscribe to the channel and like this video. It helps us preserve these stories. And please, share your own memories or thoughts in the comments below.